Welcome to Drift Away Stories. I'm here to take you on a peaceful journey through time and adventure, where you become a subject in history's greatest moments. Get comfortable, close your eyes, and let your mind drift away as we explore worlds beyond your imagination. If these stories help you find rest and escape, consider subscribing for more adventures, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight. Now, let's begin your journey. The bells of St. Bartholomew's Church toll their mournful rhythm for the 7th time today, each bronze voice marking another soul, departed from your village of Ashwell in the autumn of 1348. You stand at the narrow window of your father's workshop, watching as yet another funeral procession winds its way through the muddy streets toward the cemetery that has grown threefold in size over the past 2 months. Your name is Thomas Fletcher, 24 years old, a master craftsman who shapes arrows for the local garrison and hunting parties. But the skills that once brought prosperity to your family now seem meaningless in the face of the pestilence that has transformed your world into a realm of death and despair. The disease arrived in England with merchant ships from the continent, carried by traders who brought more than exotic goods and foreign coins to British shores. Stories had reached your village months earlier about a terrible mortality sweeping across Europe, entire cities emptied, monasteries left with only a handful of survivors, trade routes abandoned as merchants feared to travel. But like most people in your isolated corner of Hertfordshire, you believed that distance and God's providence would protect your community from whatever affliction plagued the distant lands across the Channel. How wrong you were. The Great Mortality, as the learned men call it, recognizes no boundaries of geography, social station, or divine favor. It strikes down lord and peasant with equal enthusiasm, spares neither the pious nor the wicked, and transforms thriving communities into charnel houses within weeks of its arrival. Your village, which numbered nearly 400 souls at harvest time, has already lost more than half its population to the mysterious disease that kills with such speed and certainty that many believe the end times prophesied in Revelation have finally arrived. The symptoms manifest with terrifying consistency. First, the fever and chills that leave victims shivering despite the warmth of hearth fires. Then the swelling of lymph nodes in neck, groin, and armpits that gives the disease its more common name among the common folk, the Black Death. The swellings, called buboes by physicians who have studied the affliction, grow to the size of eggs or apples and cause agony that no amount of prayer or herbal remedy seems able to relieve. Dark spots appear on the skin like Satan's fingerprints, and blood may flow from mouth and nose as the body's humors become corrupted beyond any physician's ability to balance. Most terrible of all is the speed with which the disease progresses from first symptoms to death. A man who seems healthy at morning prayers may be dead before evening vespers, his family left to mourn and wonder whether they too carry the seeds of their own destruction within their bodies. The uncertainty creates a psychological torment that may be worse than the physical suffering. Every headache might herald the beginning of the end. Every moment of fatigue could signal the onset of fever that will culminate in death within days. Your own family has been touched by the pestilence in ways that have shattered the comfortable certainties of your previous existence. Your younger brother Edmund, just 18 and recently married to the miller's daughter, succumbed 3 weeks ago after an illness that lasted only 4 days. Your sister Margaret, who served as housekeeper for the local priest, died even more quickly. Fever and buboes appearing overnight, death following before the church bells could complete their call to morning prayers. Only you and your father remain of a family that once planned to expand the workshop and perhaps establish branches in neighboring villages. The economic disruption caused by the plague's arrival has been almost as devastating as the direct mortality. The carefully ordered medieval world, where every person knew their place and role in society's hierarchy, has crumbled as death claims essential workers, regardless of their importance to community survival. The village blacksmith died in the second week, leaving no one with the skills to maintain essential tools and horseshoes. The mill ceased operating when the miller and his 2 sons perished within days of each other, forcing surviving villagers to travel dangerous distances to grind grain for bread. Your father, Master William Fletcher, has aged a decade in the 2 months since the plague's arrival, his hair turning white and his hands developing a tremor that affects his once precise craftsmanship. The loss of your siblings has broken something fundamental in his spirit, leaving him to question the divine plan that would allow such suffering to befall his family, despite their faithful service to God and community. His workshop, once renowned throughout the county for producing arrows that flew true and struck hard, now operates sporadically as both demand and ability to work have been compromised by the ongoing crisis. The world is ending, Thomas, he tells you as you both work in silence, crafting arrows from ashwood that may never be used, since so many of the soldiers who would have purchased them are now buried in the expanding cemetery. The scholars say this pestilence is God's judgment upon mankind for our sins. But what sins could little Margaret have committed? What evil did Edmund do to deserve such a death? His questions echoed the theological debates raging in churches and universities across Europe, where learned men struggle to reconcile the reality of mass death with their understanding of divine justice and mercy. The village priest, Father Benedict, has been working without rest to provide comfort to the dying and properly bury the dead. But even his faith has been tested by the magnitude of suffering he witnesses daily. His sermons have grown darker and more apocalyptic as the death toll mounts, filled with references to divine wrath and the need for repentance before the final judgment arrives. Yet his actions demonstrate compassion that transcends his increasingly grim theology. He tends the sick without regard for his own safety, buries the dead when no family members survive to perform the task, and provides what comfort he can to those who face death alone. The breakdown of normal social structures has created both opportunities and dangers that would have been unimaginable before the plague's arrival. Abandoned properties lie empty with no legal heirs to claim them, while essential services go unperformed because the people who provided them have died. Some survivors have taken advantage of the chaos to seize property or goods that don't rightfully belong to them, while others have dedicated themselves to helping fellow villagers survive the ongoing crisis, regardless of previous social distinctions. Your own survival thus far seems to result from a combination of luck, caution, and perhaps some natural resistance to the disease that claims others so readily. You have avoided large gatherings where the pestilence seems to spread most quickly, maintained careful attention to cleanliness in ways that your grandmother taught you, and perhaps most importantly, avoided contact with obviously sick individuals despite the Christian duty to care for afflicted neighbors. The moral weight of this decision troubles your conscience, but watching your siblings die, despite their charitable acts toward plague victims, has convinced you that survival requires harsh choices that peacetime morality would condemn. The autumn weather has been unusually warm and humid, conditions that seem to favor the disease's spread while creating additional discomfort for those already suffering from fever and the weakness. The air itself feels thick and corrupted, carrying strange odors that some blame on poisoned wells or malevolent vapors rising from disturbed graves. Physicians who have studied the ancient texts speak of miasma, bad air that carries disease, though their remedies of burning aromatic herbs and avoiding marshlands have proven no more effective than the folk cures employed by village wise women. Food has become increasingly scarce as agricultural work has been disrupted by illness and death among the peasant families who normally tend the fields and harvest crops. The surviving villagers face the prospect of winter with insufficient stores of grain, preserved meat, and other necessities that require careful planning and hard work during the growing season. Your family's workshop, which once provided steady income that could purchase whatever food you needed, now operates at a loss as demand for arrows has collapsed along with the social order that once supported such specialized crafts. The roads that once carried merchants, pilgrims, and travelers between villages and towns have become dangerous pathways where desperate people commit acts of violence that would have been unthinkable in more stable times. Bands of survivors from devastated communities roam the countryside seeking food, shelter, and opportunities to rebuild their shattered lives. But their presence threatens the remaining resources of villages that are already struggling to support their own reduced populations. The breaking down of law and order has made travel extremely hazardous, isolating communities and preventing the mutual aid that might help everyone survive the continuing crisis. Your workshop has become a refuge where neighbors gather to share news, pool resources, and plan for survival through the coming winter. The building's sturdy construction and defensible location make it suitable for storing communal supplies and providing shelter if the village is threatened by outsiders. More importantly, the presence of your arrow-making tools and materials provides some capability for defense if the breakdown of social order leads to open conflict between survivors, competing for scarce resources. The conversations that take place in your workshop reveal the psychological toll that constant exposure to death and uncertainty has inflicted on the surviving villagers. People who once took pride in their piety now question whether God has abandoned them, while others interpret the plague as a test of faith that must be endured with patience and humility. Some speak of fleeing to distant lands that might be spared from the pestilence, while others argue that attempting to travel would only expose them to greater dangers on roads filled with desperate people and possibly carrying the disease to new victims. Agnes Whitmore, the baker's widow whose husband died in the first wave of illness, has emerged as an informal leader among the village women through her practical approach to survival planning and her ability to organize collective efforts to care for orphaned children and maintain essential services. Her workshop, converted from bread making to more general food preparation, serves as a distribution center for the remaining food supplies and a gathering place where important decisions about community survival are made. We must think beyond mere survival, she argues, during one of the evening discussions that have become routine as darkness falls and work becomes impossible. If we live through this winter, we need to plan for spring planting and rebuilding what has been lost. The pestilence will pass eventually. It must, or there will be no one left. And those who survive must be prepared to restore their communities and help civilization continue. Her optimism provides a counterbalance to the despair that threatens to overwhelm villagers who see only death and destruction around them. But her practical plans for survival require difficult decisions about resource allocation and mutual obligations that test the bonds holding the remaining community together. Should the limited food supplies be distributed equally among all survivors, or should priority be given to those most likely to survive the winter and contribute to rebuilding efforts? Can the village support the growing number of orphan children, or must some be sent to relatives in other communities that may themselves be struggling with the plague's effects? The approaching winter adds urgency to these discussions as the weather grows colder and the shortened days make outdoor work increasingly difficult. The harvest that should have been completed by now remains largely ungathered in fields where the farmers who planted the crops are now buried in the cemetery. What grain has been collected must be carefully rationed to last through a winter that could extend well into the following spring, while the lack of adequate firewood supplies threatens to make heating an impossible luxury for families whose breadwinners have died. Your own skills as an arrow maker have proven surprisingly adaptable to other forms of carpentry and tool making that the village needs for survival preparations. The same precision and attention to detail that creates effective arrows can be applied to repairing damaged buildings, crafting essential household items, and creating the simple machines needed for processing food and other materials. Your workshop has become a center for manufacturing and repair work that helps the entire community prepare for the challenges ahead. The spiritual crisis created by the plague's devastation has led to both increased religious devotion and growing skepticism about traditional teachings regarding divine justice and mercy. Some villagers attend church services with desperate fervor, believing that sufficient prayer and repentance might convince God to end the pestilence and restore their previous lives. Others have begun to question whether the established church truly understands God's will, or whether the clergy themselves have been abandoned by the divine power they claim to represent. Father Benedict's response to these spiritual challenges demonstrates both the strengths and limitations of medieval religious instruction. When confronted with catastrophes that exceed anything described in theological texts, his sermons acknowledge the difficulty of maintaining faith in the face of seemingly random suffering, but his explanations rely heavily on concepts of divine mystery and the need for human humility before God's incomprehensible plan. While his words provide comfort to some parishioners, others find his intellectual approach inadequate for addressing their emotional and spiritual needs. The children who have survived the plague present particular challenges as they struggle to understand why their parents, siblings, and friends have died while they remain alive. Many display signs of psychological trauma that manifest as nightmares, unusual fearfulness, or inappropriate emotional responses to normal situations. The traditional support systems that would help children cope with loss, extended families, stable community structures, and predictable daily routines have been shattered by the plague's impact, leaving young survivors without the guidance and security they need for healthy development. Your workshop has become an unofficial school where you teach practical skills to boys who have lost their fathers and need training in trades that will allow them to support themselves and eventually start families of their own. The traditional apprenticeship system, which relied on formal agreements between masters and the fathers of prospective students, has collapsed along with so many other medieval institutions. Instead, you find yourself taking responsibility for passing on essential knowledge to the next generation, while adapting traditional methods to accommodate the changed circumstances of post-plague society. The isolation imposed by the breakdown of trade and communication has forced your village to become far more self-sufficient than ever before, requiring the development of skills and capabilities that were previously provided by specialists from other communities. The absence of traveling merchants means that essential goods like salt, iron, and luxury items that provided incentives for hard work are no longer available through normal trade networks. This economic isolation forces innovation and adaptation that might eventually lead to greater local resilience, but in the short term creates additional hardships for people already struggling with the plague's direct effects. As autumn progresses toward winter, and the plague continues to claim lives despite all efforts to understand and combat it, you find yourself contemplating questions that would never have occurred to your pre-plague consciousness. What is the purpose of human civilization if it can be so easily destroyed by forces beyond human control? How should individuals balance their obligations to community welfare against their personal survival needs? What kind of world will emerge if enough people survive to rebuild society? And what lessons from this catastrophe should guide that reconstruction? Your survival thus far has been purchased through a combination of luck, caution, and decisions that sometimes conflict with the moral teachings that previously guided your actions. The guilt that accompanies this recognition wars with gratitude for continued life and the responsibility you feel toward other survivors who depend on your skills and leadership. The simple certainties of medieval life, where everyone knew their place in God's plan and society's hierarchy, have been replaced by complex moral calculations that require constant decision-making in situations where all available choices carry significant risks and potential costs. The first snow arrives earlier than anyone expected, coating the half-empty village in a deceptive blanket of purity that cannot hide the fresh graves or abandoned houses beneath its pristine surface. You stand in the doorway of your workshop, watching fat flakes fall silently onto a world transformed beyond recognition since the plague's arrival 4 months ago. The beauty of the snow-covered landscape creates a painful contrast with the human devastation it conceals, reminding you that nature continues its eternal cycles regardless of the mortality that has swept away so many of your friends and neighbors. Winter's early arrival accelerates the urgency of survival preparations that have consumed every daylight hour since the plague's initial wave began to subside. Your village, reduced from nearly 400 souls to fewer than 150, faces the coming months with insufficient food stores, inadequate fuel supplies, and a breakdown of the cooperative networks that once ensured community survival through the darkest season. The margin for error has disappeared entirely. Miscalculations about resource allocation or failures in mutual support could easily result in deaths that would further reduce the population below the threshold needed for long-term viability. Your father's health has deteriorated markedly as winter approaches, the combination of grief, overwork, and constant stress taking a toll that no amount of careful nutrition or herbal remedies seems able to reverse. The tremor in his hands has worsened to the point where fine craftswork becomes impossible for hours at a time, forcing you to assume primary responsibility for both arrow making and the general carpentry work that provides essential services to the surviving community. His wisdom and experience remain invaluable for planning and decision-making, but the physical demands of survival increasingly fall upon your shoulders. The relationship between you and Agnes Whitmore has evolved from practical cooperation to something deeper and more complex as the shared burdens of community leadership create bonds that transcend normal social boundaries. Her husband's death left her responsible not only for her own survival, but also for coordinating food distribution and childcare among the remaining families. Your complementary skills, her organizational abilities, and knowledge of food preparation, your craftsmanship and growing reputation for sound judgment, have made you natural partners in the informal leadership structure that has emerged from the collapse of traditional village authority. The conversations you share during the long evening hours, when the day's work is complete and the surviving villagers gather around fires to conserve fuel and maintain morale, reveal intellectual depths and emotional complexity that peacetime social conventions would never have allowed you to discover. Agnes possesses a keen understanding of human nature that guides her decisions about resource allocation and conflict resolution, while her optimism about eventual recovery provides hope that sustains community spirit through the darkest moments of despair. "We are building something new," she tells you one evening as you work together to repair wooden bowls that must serve for months longer than their makers intended. The old world, with its rigid divisions between lord and peasant, its assumption that some lives matter more than others, that world died with the plague victims. What emerges from this catastrophe will be shaped by choices we make now, while survival depends on cooperation rather than competition. Her vision of social transformation emerging from catastrophe resonates with your own observations about how crisis has broken down barriers that once seemed natural and permanent. The baker's widow now advises the surviving members of merchant families about business decisions, while you provide carpentry services to households that would never have acknowledged your existence in the old social hierarchy. The plague has created a strange democracy of survival where competence and character matter more than birth or inherited wealth. The practical challenges of winter survival require innovations that push the boundaries of traditional medieval technology and social organization. The reduced population means that labor-intensive activities like maintaining multiple hearth fires, become impossible luxuries, forcing families to consolidate into shared dwellings where communal heating conserves precious fuel while providing social support that helps combat the psychological effects of isolation and loss. Your workshop, with its large central fireplace and sturdy construction, has become a gathering place where a dozen families spend their evenings in collective warmth and security. Food preservation has become a critical skill as the early winter threatens to extend the season when fresh provisions are unavailable. Agnes has organized teams of women to process the limited meat supplies available from livestock that cannot be maintained through the cold months, using techniques of smoking, salting, and fat storage that require careful coordination and shared resources. The knowledge possessed by elderly villagers who remember previous famines has become precious wisdom that guides decisions about rationing and preparation methods. Your arrow-making skills have proven surprisingly adaptable to crafting the specialized tools needed for winter survival activities. Ice fishing requires hooks and spears that demand the same precision and attention to materials that characterizes good arrow construction, while trap making for small game applies similar principles of engineering and understanding of natural forces. The workshop that once focused exclusively on military and hunting arrows has become a general manufacturing center where essential survival equipment is produced according to community needs rather than individual profit. The children who have lost parents in the plague present both challenges and opportunities as the community struggles to maintain educational and cultural continuity despite the loss of so many adult teachers and role models. Your workshop has become an informal school where practical skills are passed on to boys who must learn trades that will allow them to support themselves and contribute to community welfare, while Agnes organizes instruction for girls in the domestic skills that will be essential for rebuilding family life when the crisis passes. Young Robert Carpenter, whose family name now carries bitter irony since both his father and uncle died in the plague's early weeks, has become your primary apprentice, despite being only 14 years old. His quick intelligence and steady temperament make him valuable for delicate work, while his eagerness to learn provides hope that essential skills will survive into the next generation. The traditional 7-year apprenticeship system has been compressed into intensive daily training that must accomplish in months what would normally require years of gradual development. Will we ever build things as fine as the old masters made? Robert asks one afternoon, as you show him the techniques for selecting and shaping arrow shafts from seasoned ash wood. His question reflects concerns shared by many survivors about whether the accumulated knowledge and cultural achievements of previous generations can be preserved and transmitted despite the catastrophic disruption of normal educational systems. We will build different things, you reply, trying to balance honesty about the challenges ahead with encouragement for his continued effort. The old masters worked in times of peace and plenty, when they could afford to spend months perfecting a single piece. We must learn to create quickly and efficiently, making things that serve essential needs even if they lack the ornamental beauty that was possible when survival was assured. The psychological impact of constant exposure to death and uncertainty has created changes in personality and behavior that extend far beyond the immediate responses to grief and fear. Some survivors have become hypervigilant and suspicious, viewing every stranger as a potential threat and hoarding resources against imagined future shortages. Others have developed an almost reckless generosity, sharing their possessions freely as if material goods have lost all meaning in the face of mortality's constant presence. Your own response to the crisis has been a growing sense of responsibility for community welfare that sometimes conflicts with purely personal survival instincts. The leadership role that has developed naturally from your workshop's central position and your reputation for sound judgment carries obligations that extend far beyond your immediate family's needs. Decisions about resource allocation, conflict resolution, and long-term planning affect the survival chances of everyone in the village, creating pressure that no amount of previous experience could have prepared you to handle. The absence of traditional authority figures. The lord of the manor died in the plague's second wave, while the sheriff and other royal officials have abandoned the area to focus on regions with larger surviving populations, has created a power vacuum that informal leaders like yourself and Agnes must fill, despite having no legal authority or formal training for such responsibilities. The governance that emerges from these circumstances relies heavily on consensus and mutual agreement rather than established hierarchy, creating a more democratic but also more fragile system of social organization. The winter weather brings both immediate dangers and unexpected opportunities as the reduced population discovers advantages in the changed circumstances of post-plague life. The abandoned fields and empty houses provide resources that can be salvaged for community use, while the reduced pressure on natural resources means that firewood, game animals, and wild plant foods are more abundant for the survivors than they were before the plague's arrival. These advantages must be weighed against the loss of specialized knowledge and the breakdown of trade networks that once provided goods unavailable in the local area. Religious observance has evolved in response to the crisis as Father Benedict adapts traditional liturgy and teaching to address the spiritual needs of a community that has experienced catastrophic loss. His sermons increasingly emphasize themes of resurrection and renewal rather than divine judgment, while his pastoral care focuses on practical comfort and mutual support rather than abstract theological concepts. The church building itself has become a center for community meetings and collective decision-making. Its sacred space providing neutral ground where disputes can be resolved and plans can be made without the complications of family or economic loyalties. The feast of Christmas arrives with little of the celebration that normally marks the season, but the shared adversity has created its own form of sacred observance as the surviving families gather to acknowledge their continued existence and renew their commitment to mutual support. The gifts exchanged are simple and practical: tools repaired or improved, clothing mended or altered to fit new wearers, food prepared with special care to provide momentary luxury in otherwise austere circumstances. These modest offerings carry symbolic weight that expensive presents could never achieve, representing the investment of precious time and scarce resources in relationships that transcend mere survival necessity. Agnes presents you with a set of small woodworking tools that she has commissioned from the surviving blacksmith, their handles carved with decorative patterns that demonstrate both artistic skill and personal attention to your needs and preferences. The gesture touches you more deeply than any grand display of wealth could have managed, representing not only practical support for your work, but also recognition of your importance to her personally and to the community's future welfare. Your own gift to her, a writing desk constructed from salvaged oak and fitted with compartments for storing documents and writing materials, reflects both your growing skill at furniture making and your understanding of her role in maintaining the records and correspondence that help bind the scattered community together. The desk construction required months of evening work, stealing time from other essential tasks to create something beautiful as well as functional in a world where beauty has become a rare and precious commodity. The new year brings both renewed hope and sobering recognition of how much work remains to be done before the community can consider itself truly secure. The winter's harshest months lie ahead, with February and March traditionally claiming the highest mortality rates among populations already weakened by disease and malnutrition. The food stores that seemed adequate in autumn now appear dangerously depleted when calculated against the remaining weeks of cold weather. While the fuel supplies require constant attention and careful rationing to last until spring, weather makes foraging possible again. Planning for spring planting becomes an urgent priority as the surviving villagers realize that their food security for the following year depends on decisions made now about which fields to cultivate, which crops to plant, and how to allocate the limited labor available for agricultural work. The traditional three-field system that maximized production when labor was abundant becomes impractical with a reduced population, forcing adaptation to intensive cultivation methods that require different crops and different techniques than previous generations employed. Your workshop has become a planning center where maps of village lands are drawn and redrawn as the survivors consider how to make best use of their reduced numbers and available resources. The fields that once supported 400 people now need to be evaluated for their suitability to support 150, while the abandoned farmsteads must be assessed for their potential contribution to community welfare through salvage operations or possible reoccupation if the population begins to recover. The knowledge possessed by elderly survivors becomes increasingly precious as the community recognizes how much traditional wisdom has been lost with the plague victims. Old Martha, the wise woman whose herbal remedies and agricultural advice have guided village decisions for decades, has become a living library whose memories must be preserved and transmitted before another winter claims additional lives. Her evenings are spent in your workshop, sharing stories and practical knowledge with younger villagers who must learn in months what she acquired through decades of experience. The land remembers. She tells her audience of intent listeners as snow continues to fall outside the workshop windows. Fields that produced good grain for your grandfathers will produce good grain for your grandchildren if you treat them with proper respect and understanding. The plague may have taken our people, but it has not changed the soil or the seasons. Those who survive must learn to work with what remains and to trust that life continues even when death seems to surround us. Her words provide both practical guidance for agricultural planning and philosophical comfort for people who struggle to maintain hope in the face of overwhelming loss. The continuity she represents, her personal memory stretching back to times before any current crisis, her confidence in patterns that transcend individual human lifespan, offers perspective that helps younger survivors maintain their commitment to rebuilding rather than merely enduring until their own deaths release them from responsibility. The workshop sessions, where village plans are developed and refined, have become exercises in collective problem solving that demonstrate both the potential and the limitations of democratic decision-making under extreme circumstances. When resources are severely limited and mistakes could prove fatal, the luxury of extensive debate and consensus building must be balanced against the need for quick, decisive action based on the best available information and judgment. Your role in these discussions has evolved from providing technical expertise about construction and manufacturing to serving as a mediator between competing viewpoints and conflicting interests. The respect you have earned through consistent reliability and sound judgment gives your opinions weight that helps resolve disputes and build consensus around difficult decisions. This leadership responsibility brings satisfaction, but also anxiety, as you recognize how much depends on your ability to make wise choices under pressure. The late winter brings the first hints that the plague's virulence may be diminishing as weeks pass without new cases among the surviving population. Whether this represents the disease burning itself out through lack of new victims, seasonal variation in its transmission, or some form of acquired resistance among the survivors, remains unclear. But the absence of fresh mortality allows the community to focus entirely on survival and rebuilding, rather than constant crisis response. The approaching spring creates both anticipation and anxiety as the survivors prepare to test their planning and preparations against the realities of agricultural production with severely reduced labor and resources. The success or failure of the coming growing season will determine whether the village can achieve genuine self-sufficiency or whether additional population loss through starvation will reduce the community below the threshold needed for long-term viability. The first green shoots pierce through the melting snow like tiny banners of victory, announcing that spring has arrived to find your village still breathing, still hoping, still determined to rebuild from the ashes of the plague years. You kneel beside one of the experimental garden plots that Agnes organized behind the church, examining the young plants that represent not just food for the coming months, but proof that life continues despite the devastation that claimed so many of your neighbors. The simple act of planting seeds in soil warmed by the returning sun carries symbolic weight that transcends mere agriculture. It represents faith in a future that extends beyond survival to encompass renewal and growth. The winter's end reveals both the extent of what has been lost and the foundation upon which recovery can be built. Your village's population has stabilized at just over 100 souls, a number that includes 17 children under the age of 15 and 23 adults over 50. The demographic imbalance creates challenges for agricultural labor and long-term sustainability, but it also demonstrates that the community possesses the basic human resources needed for gradual recovery. If the coming year's harvests prove adequate to support the reduced population. Your father passed away during the final weeks of winter his death peaceful rather than plague-related, but nonetheless devastating for the loss of his accumulated wisdom and experience. His funeral became a community celebration of his life and contributions, with every surviving villager attending to pay respects to a man whose craftsmanship and steady character had helped hold the community together during its darkest hours. The workshop that bears his lifetime of improvements and innovations now belongs entirely to you, along with the responsibility for maintaining the essential services that his skills provided to village life. The grief that accompanies your father's death has been tempered by the recognition that his final months were spent seeing the worst of the crisis pass and the beginnings of recovery take shape. He lived to see the spring planting begin, to witness the formation of new partnerships and alliances that will guide the village's future development, and to know that the knowledge he possessed would continue through your own work and that of young Robert, whose apprenticeship has progressed to the point where he can handle most routine tasks independently. Agnes's role in your life has evolved beyond partnership in community leadership to something approaching marriage in all but formal recognition. The shared responsibilities of the past year have created bonds that transcend the careful courtship rituals that normally precede medieval unions, while the practical necessities of household management and childcare have made formal distinctions between engagement and marriage seem artificial and unnecessary. Your decision to share living quarters in the expanded workshop reflects both emotional commitment and practical efficiency in managing the multiple roles you both fulfill within the community. The prospect of children has become a source of both joy and anxiety as you contemplate raising a family in a world so fundamentally changed from the one in which you grew up. The knowledge and values you would want to transmit to the next generation must be balanced against the practical skills and psychological resilience that will be necessary for thriving in post-plague society. The innocence and security that characterized your own childhood seem impossible to recreate, but the strength and adaptability that the crisis has fostered might prove equally valuable for children who will inherit a world shaped by both catastrophe and recovery. The spring planting season tests every aspect of the survival planning that occupied the winter months, revealing both the strengths and limitations of the community's adaptive strategies. The decision to concentrate agricultural efforts on the most fertile fields while allowing less productive lands to return to forest proves sound, providing sufficient growing space for essential crops while reducing the labor requirements to manageable levels. The intensive cultivation methods adopted from examples of successful farming in other regions show early promise, though their long-term sustainability will require several seasons to evaluate properly. Your workshop has become a manufacturing center that supports agricultural activities through the production of improved tools and equipment designed to maximize efficiency with reduced labor. The plows, harrows, and harvesting implements you create incorporate innovations learned from traveling craftsmen and adapted to local conditions and available materials. These improvements represent not just practical solutions to immediate problems, but also evidence that technological progress can continue, even in the aftermath of demographic catastrophe. The arrival of spring brings the first travelers to visit your village since the plague's initial outbreak, providing news of conditions in other regions and opportunities to re-establish trade relationships that were severed by the crisis. The stories these merchants and pilgrims tell reveal that your community's survival and adaptation strategies have been more successful than those employed in many other areas where complete abandonment or descent into lawlessness has left once thriving settlements as empty ruins or dangerous territories controlled by bands of desperate survivors. Brother Marcus, a Benedictine monk traveling from monastery to assess the plague's impact on religious communities, provides particularly valuable information about recovery efforts across England and the continent. His accounts of successful rebuilding projects offer models that your village might adapt to local conditions, while his stories of failed attempts at reconstruction provide warnings about strategies that appear promising but ultimately prove unsustainable. Your community has achieved something remarkable, he tells the assembled villagers during an evening gathering in your workshop. In most places, the survivors either fled to join larger groups or attempted to maintain their old ways despite changed circumstances. You have done neither. Instead, you have created something new that preserves the best elements of traditional village life while adapting to the realities of reduced population and disrupted social structures. His observations confirm what you have suspected, that the innovations forced by necessity have positioned your village to thrive in the post-plague world rather than merely survive it. The democratic decision-making processes, the emphasis on practical skills over inherited status, and the cooperative approach to resource management represent adaptations that could prove superior to pre-plague social organization, even when population levels eventually recover. The summer growing season provides the first real test of the agricultural strategies developed during the winter planning sessions. The concentrated cultivation of selected fields yields better results than anyone dared hope, producing not only sufficient food for the reduced population, but also surplus that can be preserved for the following winter, or traded with other communities for goods unavailable locally. The success validates the decision to focus resources on intensive rather than extensive farming, while demonstrating that smaller populations can achieve higher per capita productivity when land and resources are abundant relative to labor. Your workshop's production has expanded beyond arrows and agricultural tools to include furniture, household goods, and specialized equipment for the various crafts that have developed to serve community needs. The absence of imported goods has forced local innovation in everything from soap making to textile production, creating opportunities for survivors to develop skills that were previously unnecessary when such items could be purchased from traveling merchants or specialized craftsmen in larger towns. Young Robert has progressed to the point where he can handle most woodworking projects independently, freeing you to focus on more complex tasks and community leadership responsibilities. His marriage to Sarah, the baker's daughter who survived the plague that claimed both her parents, represents the first wedding celebration since the crisis began and signals the community's confidence in its future stability. The ceremony, held in the renovated church with the entire surviving population in attendance, becomes an affirmation of life and hope that strengthens everyone's commitment to the rebuilding effort. The autumn harvest confirms that the agricultural experiments have succeeded beyond initial expectations. producing food supplies adequate to support the current population through another winter, while providing seed stock for expanded planting in the following year. The preservation techniques developed during the previous autumn prove their worth as the community prepares stores of dried, smoked, and salted provisions that should last until the next growing season without the desperate rationing that characterized the first post-plague winter. Agnes's pregnancy, announced as the harvest celebrations conclude, brings joy that extends throughout the community as people recognize that new life represents the ultimate victory over the forces that threaten to destroy their society entirely. The prospect of children born into the post-plague world creates additional motivation for long-term planning and community development, while providing hope that the knowledge and values preserved through the crisis will have inheritors worthy of the sacrifices made by those who died and those who struggled to survive. The second winter proves far more manageable than the first, with adequate supplies, improved heating arrangements, and the psychological comfort that comes from having successfully navigated the worst challenges of post-plague survival. The workshop sessions that once focused on desperate crisis planning now address longer-term questions about community growth, economic development, and the preservation of cultural traditions that give meaning to daily existence beyond mere survival. The birth of your son, William, named for your father, but destined to live in a world that would be unrecognizable to previous generations, occurs during the darkest days of February, but brings light that illuminates the entire community's future prospects. The midwifery skills that Agnes learned from old Martha prove adequate for a successful delivery, while the collective celebration that follows demonstrates how thoroughly the traditional boundaries between families have dissolved into a network of mutual support and shared responsibility. Brother Marcus returns in early spring, with news that confirms your village's exceptional success compared to other recovery efforts throughout England. The combination of democratic governance, economic cooperation, and technological innovation has created a model that other surviving communities are beginning to adopt, while scholars and church officials have begun to study your adaptations as possible templates for broader social reconstruction. You have demonstrated that catastrophe can become opportunity, he explains during his second visit. The old world assumed that stability came from rigid hierarchy and unchanging tradition, but you have proven that adaptive flexibility and cooperative innovation can create stronger foundations for human community. Your example offers hope that Europe's recovery from the plague years will result in a better society rather than merely a restored version of what existed before. The third spring brings visitors from distant regions who come specifically to observe your community's innovations and learn from your experience. These delegations include representatives from surviving noble houses, church officials responsible for reconstruction efforts, and merchants seeking to establish trade relationships with communities that have achieved genuine prosperity rather than mere survival. The attention validates your village's achievements while creating opportunities for broader influence that could help shape the post-plague world's development. Your workshop has evolved into a combination manufacturing center, community meeting hall, and informal university where innovations are developed and knowledge is preserved for transmission to other communities. The techniques you have pioneered in everything from agricultural tools to governance structures are being documented and shared with visitors who carry them to other regions, creating a network of communication and mutual support that helps accelerate recovery efforts across wide areas. The decision to formally incorporate your village as an independent commune, with written charters that codify the democratic processes and cooperative economic arrangements that have evolved through practical necessity, represents recognition that your innovations have created something worth preserving and protecting as the wider world begins to reorganize itself. The legal framework provides security for the investments in infrastructure and development that long-term prosperity requires, while establishing precedents that could influence broader legal and political development. Agnes's role, the community's informal leader, has gained formal recognition through her election as the first mayor under the new charter, a position that acknowledges both her practical contributions to survival and rebuilding and her vision for future development. Her acceptance speech emphasizes themes that have guided the community throughout the crisis: cooperation over competition, innovation over tradition, and hope over despair. We have learned that human society is more resilient and adaptable than our ancestors imagined, she tells the assembled villagers during the charter ceremony. The plague took much from us, but it also freed us to discover better ways of living together and working toward common goals. What we build here will outlast all of us and provide inspiration for communities yet to be founded. Your own election as master craftsman and head of the village council reflects recognition of your role in both preserving essential skills and fostering the innovations that have made prosperity possible. The position carries responsibility for maintaining the workshop as a center for technological development, while ensuring that the knowledge accumulated through crisis and recovery is preserved for future generations. Young Robert's development into a master craftsman in his own right, capable of training apprentices and managing complex projects independently, represents the successful transmission of essential skills to the next generation. His marriage to Sarah has produced children who will grow up in a world where cooperation and innovation are normal rather than desperate responses to crisis, providing hope that the values forged through hardship will become permanent features of the community's character. The fall spring brings the first signs that population growth through both new births and immigration from other regions may soon require expansion of agricultural production and housing facilities. The prospect of managing growth while preserving the social innovations that have made recovery possible creates new challenges that require the same adaptive thinking that guided survival through the worst phases of the crisis. The workshop that began as your father's arrow-making business has become the heart of a thriving community that demonstrates humanity's capacity for renewal and improvement, even in the aftermath of unprecedented catastrophe. The skills you have developed, the relationships you have formed, and the innovations you have pioneered represent achievements that exceed anything you could have imagined during the dark days when survival seemed uncertain and hope appeared foolish. As you stand in the doorway of your workshop, watching children play in streets that once echoed with funeral bells, you realize that the plague years taught lessons about human resilience and adaptability that no peaceful period could have provided. The community you helped build from the ashes of the old world has become something stronger and more humane than what existed before. Proof that catastrophe can indeed become the foundation for genuine progress rather than merely an interruption in the march of time. Your survival of the medieval plague has taught you that individuals matter most, not for what they preserve from the past, but for what they contribute to the future. And that the greatest victory over death comes not from avoiding it, but from ensuring that life continues in forms that honor both the sacrifices of those who were lost and the hopes of those yet to be born.